feels that way, like all the time. But
everyone that she helped,
it isn't true.
he'll keep it going.
I can finally see.
You really think so?
I know it. Take care of yourself, okay?
Home Alone franchise, Baby's Day Out, Young Sheldon, Peter Pan, Baby Driver, Keith Haring's Vibrating Babies, all those prodigies invited on Ellen DeGeneres' show, kids from Steve Harvey, Spider-Man getting younger and younger, those young geniuses who invent computers and gadgets in their garages, to which elders need to constantly adapt. What's going on with the Western society and the veneration of the youth and the adulation of the children? Is child veneration and worshipping the youth particularly a Western thing? Do other cultures also have the same attitude toward the so-called wonder child? In this iceberg of child adulation, I'll track down the origins of this phenomenon. Now, one film that I deliberately left out is The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, based on Scott Fitzgerald's short novel. Here the aging process is reversed and the child is born as an old person and subsequently transforms into an infant. As cultural critic John David Ebert points out, this film shows the evolution of the God of the Bible, beginning with the old grizzled man in the Old Testament, getting to young 30-year-old Jesus in the New Testament, and finally reaching the infant Jesus on the lap of the Virgin Mary. The icon of Madonna and the child where Jesus is pointed to as the future fruit of progress and potentiality becomes the primary iconotype of the Western psyche. To grasp the symbolic importance of this icon, we first need to identify what the baby Jesus represents here. Now I would like to draw your attention to one of my favorite franchises, the Home Alone, which I think best illustrates what Gene Gebser calls the child adulation as a characteristic of Western society. Thus, the film, being at the tip of the iceberg, provides us with three major elements of the Western ethos that will help us descend into the deeper layers of child adulation. First is the principle of motherly care, as in the franchise, Kevin's mother is outstandingly disturbed by the ongoing situation, expressing deep concern for her son. The second is Christmas, which will lead us to Jesus, the wonder child of Bethlehem, and the concept of future. Future as in how we are always thrilled in contemplating what the wonder child as a symbol of progress will achieve when he reaches the adulthood. The root feeling of care is quite noteworthy here, as the neo-Jungian school treats intellectualism as a man's attempt to escape the womb of the devouring mother. The intellectual hocus pocuses are his new power domain where the mother becomes powerless. And the third is of course the engineering mind of the wonder child, who changes society with the power of gadgets and technological advancement. In general, the wonder child symbolizes the future, whereby the cult and the weight of the ancestral legacy are overpowered by the hubris and rebellious ethos of the upcoming unruly child. As John David Ebert claims, every time we see a technological innovation and revolution, if you will, the burials of the dead are either absent or cemeteries are moved away from the cities. This is what he calls the rupture of mortuary practices. Dorian Greeks, for example, cremated their ancestors and moved away their cemeteries from the city. This is directly linked with the emergence of Greek inventiveness in geometric pottery, new forms of governance, new architectural styles, the pre-Socratic philosophical wave, and so on and so forth. On the flip side, the Mycenaean civilization, as Mesoamerican one, heavily relied on ancestral tradition. They either buried their dead beneath their houses or kept the bodies of their ancestors within the palaces. From the standpoint of cultural anthropology, this indicates that these civilizations are largely committed to conservation, and thus their faculty of imitation is directed to ancestors. What we see now is that civilizations that are progressive and try to imitate creative minorities are also rejecting the ontological weight of their forefathers. It is no coincidence, according to Ebert, that the dominant mode of horror for American society is the unexpected revelation that the dead are buried beneath their houses. This is the common theme in American horror films, such as Poltergeist, let's say, where in the end one finds out that the landowners, while building the new house, had not relocated the cemetery. Have you considered that Halloween, the Day of the Dead, is perhaps the shortest holiday, lasting no more than half a day? In Mesopotamia, for example, 1 day per month was dedicated to the dead, with a special place reserved at the dining table for the departed. Mexican Day of the Dead lasted 2 full days, which was inherited from the Aztecs. In Georgia, where I come from, it lasts the whole day. Ancient Egypt, with its beautiful Feast of Diwali, is no different in this regard, lasting for several days. However, it is not simply the duration of Halloween here that is significant, but the unusual reversal of the West's relationship with the ancestors. For example, in cultures that are not fundamentally progressive and where the weight of the predecessors hangs heavy, such as where I come from, for example, or in China and Mesoamerica, on the Day of the Dead people go to visit their ancestors' tombs and pay respect. Whereas in the West, ancestors are considered to be a problem that must be solved, an unnecessary burden that one has to dispense with. On Halloween then, ancestors come to your house and you should get rid of them as effectively as you possibly could, arming yourself with jack-o'-lanterns and giving candies to children so that the spirit of ancestors could be warded off. Thus we have a contrast between ancient civilizations where on the Day of the Dead people visit the tombs, and in the case of Halloween the reverse takes place. While researching the treatment of the deceased, it suddenly struck my mind that in Western societies, funeral ceremonies and memorial services are extremely short and sometimes even non-existent. In America, one quickly dispenses with the deceased to get on with one's busy life, which in itself is a radicalization of general shortness of funerary ceremonies in the West. This symbolizes the West's progressive and forward-looking spirit, which, as we're going to see, is always determined by how culture treats its forefathers. On the flip side, in Eastern Orthodox countries, one holds onto the deceased as much as possible. The first cultural service in Eastern Orthodox countries held after the death takes place is the so-called panikida, where for several days the deceased stays in the house while relatives and friends come to mourn and console the family members. After the service is done, the deceased is then buried while being accompanied by a procession, which ends with a lengthy church ceremony. This in Georgia, for example, is then followed by the rite called keleki, where people gather and have an extremely large dinner to further mourn the deceased. After 40 days, there is another ceremony called the 40, where relatives gather again and have the dinner. The third one takes place on the day of the anniversary, where again close relatives gather to mourn the departed. All in all, panics happen on the first day, third day, 9th day, 40th day, and ideally at every single anniversary. Generally, in Eastern Orthodox countries, memorial services can be held numerous times after the first funerary service takes place. Now, this indicates a clear ontological difference, or morphological difference, if you will, between cultural sphere where the cult of the ancestors hangs heavy and the forward-looking progressive West, which quickly dispenses with the dead and carries on with his life. Thus, as Ebert points out, in the West, the senior citizens are not elders, but elderly, attaching negative valency to it. Throughout the video, I will touch upon the linguistics of ageism and how it differs among the different cultures. It's worth noting that Neanderthals, who were extremely conservative, are most likely the originators of the skull cult, which evidences their reverence for the ancestors. Skulls were removed from the corpses of the deceased to function as a memento and a symbolic vessel for the spirit of the dead. Now, at the dawn of the Upper Paleolithic, when Homo sapiens have already interbred and wiped out Neanderthals, we witness yet another absence of burial sites, which again coincides with technological singularity. Cro-Magnons now can boast new tools and art forms with which they enter into a new consciousness structure. John Ebert identifies 6 such technological singularities that took place in the history of humanity, where in every single instance progress and change are associated with the rupture of mortuary practices, where dead are cremated, buried in separate cemeteries beyond the city gates, or there is a complete absence of burial sites. Now, getting back to Halloween, which stems from a pagan holiday dedicated to the realm of the dead, it is clear that in the Western cultural spirit, dead and deceased are considered as a challenge and an obstacle that must be overcome by getting rid of them. Interestingly enough, Halloween takes its root from the Roman holiday of Lemuria, where Romans had to ward off the spirits of their ancestors by pouring milk and spitting out black beans for the hungry lemurs. Then, while clashing the bronze pots, Romans would repeat the following words: "Ghost of my fathers and ancestors, be gone." The Iliad, the Old Testament of Dorian Greece, is one of the oldest manifestations of the Wonder Child. The epic poem opens up with the wrath of Achilles, and this wrath, as Gebser maintains, which is called menis in Greek, is a new form of wrath, namely a directed wrath, a sort of Nietzsche's lion which has a causally pointed aim. This is not a Dionysian anger culminating in an uncontrollable frenzy, but rather it is imbued with directional energy and self-restraint coming from Athena, representing the advent of new technology and geometry of the transitional Greek culture. Menis comes from the Indo-European root words me and ma, which means thinking and measuring, later evolving into the concept of discursive thought. Ebert maintains that Achilles' wrath is a product of the opposition between the old grizzled Agamemnon, who represents the past, and the rebellious spirit of the unruly wonder child, who refuses to comply. As Alexander Karolin points out, Achilles is a late addition to the story, as he is absent from the bulk of the action, and furthermore, he would have been too young to make an oath about getting into the war. Thus, Achilles being a late addition as a wonder child who foreshadows the technological boom of Dorian Greece stands as a symbol of transformation, from the old Agamemnon to the new world age of mental consciousness structure, of abstract thought, philosophy, geometry, and Greek drama. To Ebert's analysis of Achilles, I would also add Odysseus, who, unlike characters in Iliad, is not identified with his father anymore, but rather with his mind. So, if in Iliad Achilles is always presented as a son of Peleus, pointing to the cult of the ancestors, then in Odysseus we witness a lack of thereof. No wonder Greece is the first to venerate youthfulness with its cult of the Kouros. This is what Leon McGilchrist understands as the bilateral hypertrophy of the frontal cortex that took place in the ancient Greece. Now, Greece as a progressive civilization is saturated with the cult of the wonder child. For example, Zeus was carried away by Rhea and raised in separation, so that the weight of his ancestral past, represented by Kronos, which means time, couldn't have swallowed him. Thus, Zeus becomes the force that overturns the old traditional system and establishes the new world order of the sky gods. Now, it is no coincidence that Western culture is obsessed with the figure of Achilles, Zeus, and Heracles, as in one way or another they symbolize the wonder child. As we're going to see, the Faustian Western culture reaches the culmination of the child worship. Now, here we need to look at the cult of the Virgin Mary, which experienced a literal boom in Western culture. Now, apart from infant Jesus symbolizing the progress and the advent of new technologies, we get a whole new understanding of what makes someone a mother, and thus we get a new conception of care for the future. This concept is completely absent in both Greek and Byzantine cultures. Now, it is interesting that the wonder child always has a peculiar relationship with his mother. This is the case with Kevin from Home Alone, with Achilles, who goes to his mother Thetis and whines about Agamemnon taking his woman from him, and the wonder child of Bethlehem, which will reach an apotheosis in the Western culture. Oswald Spengler points out that this lulling, caring mother that we see in the Western depiction of Madonna is completely absent in Greece and Byzantium. So, for example, in Greece we mostly meet two types of women: the Aphrodite type, which is all about sensual love and sex, and the Amazon type, a sort of dangerous, terrible mother, such as Clytemnestra, let's say. For Byzantium, the Madonna was understood as Theotokos, she who gave birth to God, whereas in the West, she's conceptualized as the Mater Dolorosa, the Mother of God. In the former, Mary is just a vessel for the Logos, as the patriarchal mental consciousness structure wrests reproductive capabilities from the eternal feminine. In the same way, wisdom symbolized by Athena springs forth from the head of Zeus. The re-emergence of Mary as the Isis and Horus as a principle of motherly care for Spengler symbolizes the care for the future. Thus, the lulling Madonna imbued with warmth, motherly love, and care for his child is a symbol of potentiality that will leave behind the mythic dualism of Magian Christianity. Spengler maintains that Gretchen from Goethe's Faust is way more related to the Western Madonna than the Western Madonna is related to the Byzantine one. Now, let's take a look at the Madonna from the Sistine Chapel. Generally, when we look at this painting, we miss what is going on behind the central figure. Now, surely you see the clouds, right? Well, let's zoom in for a second. Those clouds are turning into babies. Babies who will be brought into life by the Virgin Mary as a symbol of future transformation. As Gebser points out, creativity results from the consciousness of the Son. This is most clearly expressed in the aversion to the past which begins thereafter, the renunciation of ancestor worship in favor of worship of the child of Bethlehem. Ancestors are always those of the past, while the child represents those who are coming, those of the future. Clouds transforming into babies is a manifestation of the West's upward valency, in which Wonder Child will invent space rockets to allow us to travel beyond our terrestrial boundaries. The cult of the Virgin Mary is a portal to the new principle of Trinity, which is paradigmatically different from the Christian Trinity. Now, a Western rationalistic reconceptualization of the Trinity as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis is distinct from the mythic, as in the latter all three elements are hypostases of the one and form the mythic whole, whereas the Western Trinity is linear and pointy, with the dialectical opposition of the two, having to yield the fruitful third. As we're going to swim up from the depth of the iceberg, it will become clear that the Trinity is at the base of Western's obsession with children. Basically, what happened in the West can be called a shattering of the mystical duality of Byzantium and of early Christianity. In biblical metaphysics, let's say, history is understood not as a linear progression, but rather as a manifestation of an apocalyptic overturning. The world is a cosmic arena of two opposing forces, good and evil, heaven and earth. Subsequently, one force, the good and the divine, overpowers the other and secures its heavenly kingdom. Now, after the shattering of Augustine's mystical duality, the Western culture, being the representative of the mental consciousness structure, which prime symbol is the triangle, comes up with the third element. This paves the way for the concept of linear progress, as it is understood in the Western philosophical discourse. Progress is a hope and a deep faith that the ever-fleeting third will once and for all actualize and reform our current situation. Enlightenment, technological revolution, the conquest of nature, world peace, the Third Reich, utopian theories of different philosophers, and the conceptualization of history as ancient, medieval, and modern are all directed toward the project of future transformation. As Spengler points out, at the doors of the Western culture, we meet a great Joachim of Flores, who reconceptualized biblical teachings of the Trinity into the age of the Father, the age of the Son, and the age of the Holy Ghost. The latter is the basis of the subsequent historical model, where modern is the last and the most important stage after ancient and medieval. The addition of the third is all over the place. Even purgatorium is introduced to create the third element from the mystical binary world of heaven and hell. Thus, for the mythic Magian stamp, history is complete, and one force will prevail over the other. However, the West comes up with the unconscious presupposition that perhaps history is incomplete, and its completion will take place by the advent of the third. Faust, the personification of progress and future transformation, is dissatisfied with his predecessor's rusty technologies and dismisses his father's achievements, who was a doctor helping people fight the plague. The disrespect of your ancestors, however disconcerting it may sound, turns out to be an indispensable element of growth and transformation. Now, Faust, apart from being a symbol of Western incessant and indefatigable activity, also harbors the element of youthfulness. After giving up his soul to Mephistopheles in exchange for infinite powers, the first thing they make sure of is to visit the witch so that Faust can be rejuvenated. We will look at the West's obsession with rejuvenation and rejection of death and finitude in later section. Now then, in the early Romanesque era, we see how Jesus is being held in the center. Here again they form the mythical unity where progress and the directiveness of mental consciousness structure are latent. As we are going to see, the addition of the third, as evidenced by the emergence of perspective in Western art, where the third dimension is going to be discovered, will be foreshadowed by the gradual transition of baby Jesus from the left hand of Madonna's lap to the right hand side away from the center. This marked shift from unconscious mythical unity to the mental waking consciousness of spatiality will be the basis of the subsequent progress and technological innovation. Not only that, but Jesus shows dimensional directionality, in which he points to something, and is pointed to in turn by his mother. This is linearity and linear progress par excellence. Additionally, Madonna becomes more smiling, which Gebser takes to symbolize the awakening to itself. Now, it is no accident that the Home Alone franchise is a Christmas movie. The child of Bethlehem, a wonder child that will bring the change and transformation, is born. And in the very moment on the eve of Christmas, Kevin is reunited with his mother. The very Kevin who defeated clumsy robbers with pure technology and technological reasoning. Kevin, unlike Achilles and Jesus, is the wonder child of the West which is obsessed with engineering skills. Therefore, Kevin overpowers his enemies with the help of technology and gadgets. Now take a look at the ending of Home Alone 2 for a second. Here, Kevin is praying to God so that he can be reunited with his family. However, this scene takes place in Rockefeller Center, where we see a sculpture of Prometheus, the unruly hubris of Greece, who wrested the power of technology and brought fire to mortal humans. At the very place where Kevin is praying, there is an inscription from Aeschylus. This very essence of technology saved Kevin and made his process of individuation possible. That's why here he is actually praying to Prometheus, his personal god. And also his mother is thanking Prometheus in this scene. This is the genius wonder child that comes up with Microsoft, rockets and new gadgets that the elders have to catch up with. The adulation of the child here, as opposed to the young 30-year-old Christ or Achilles, let's say, points to the hypertrophy of progress and change. If 30-year-old Jesus would preserve some of the traditions left behind, baby Jesus is ready to do away with his ancestors and fight evil without anyone's help. Kevin's glimmering and innocent milky white face intensifies the feeling of a shining wonder child who, carrying on the ethos of Western individualism, overcomes his problems alone. Thus the movie's name, Home Alone, with the help of technology and the power of the mind, instead of resorting to his parents or ancestors. Now take a look at what Faust in Goethe's poem has to say about the leftovers of his ancestors. "You ancient gear I never used. You loom about here just because my father works you. Far better to have squandered what I had than stay and struggle with the useless junk of yesterday. What we inherit from our fathers should be ours to have and hold, to use it as we would, or else it is a ballast that we carry with us. We can use only what the here and now will give us." It is no surprise that the Western soul is preoccupied with understanding history in a Trinitarian manner. Nietzsche begins with camel, gets to the lion, and finalizes with the infant child, symbolizing rebirth and the advent of new ontological dimension. Comte's history has three phases: theological, philosophical, and the final, scientific. For Hegel, it is a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The key takeaway here is that the third always becomes the subject of dispute. It is always promised but never actually takes place. There is a reason why the obsession with the third has its pathological and monstrous manifestations, such as Third Reich, for example, where the veneration of youthfulness also took place with their cult of nudity, let's say. But the very ever-fleeting nature of the third, the very fact that Faust can never find that fleeting second, the moment where he could be satisfied with himself, is the very basis of progress, as progress is inherently an unending and incomplete process. That's why aging has to be reversed, because linear aging leads to completion and death. As Spengler points out, the West is characterized not by the static and unmovable kinema of Greece or of China, let's say, where the cult of ancestors hangs heavy over the society, but rather by kinesis, which is an incessant activity pursuing an aim but never actually achieving it. Spengler, drawing a connection between future, the principle of care, and hope, is evident in child-worshipping films. The fascination with child prodigies and characters like Kevin comes from the unconscious and sometimes conscious hope and hype, if you will, of contemplating the future of the wonder child. No wonder it was so tragic and frustrating for us viewers that Kevin didn't fulfill our hope, as people express dissatisfaction with the adult Macaulay Culkin. It's only in the West that a child can offer something wise to the elder. This scene in Home Alone 2, where Kevin basically lectures the lady about life and love and friendship, is jaw-dropping to say the least. I have yet to see something like this take place in backward-oriented cultures. Probably it would be reasonable to say that there is a connection with Greta Thunberg and those scenes. In reality, there are numerous instances where characters such as young Sheldon and others appear tough or show authority over the elderly, which is admired and respected. It's as if the wonder child is a particular obsession of the West. So for example, the match between young Magnus Carlsen and Garry Kasparov was edited in such a way as to make Magnus look better, as if Kasparov is struggling here but Magnus is cool and goes around looking at other chessboards. Although the match ended in a draw, it's the very predetermination of the Western ethos to be fascinated with the concept of the wonder child. No wonder why the concept of the indigo child, popularized by Nancy Ann Tape, comes from the West. In cultures where mimesis is directed towards ancestors and thus lacks technological innovation, you will never have such a thing as an indigo child, as everyone stays away from the veneration of children. First, before getting to the American horror genre, I want to briefly tell you about the jester or joker archetype, if you will. In Jungian psychology, jester resorts to the techne of comedy and jokes as a means to bring up repressed and unconscious thoughts. A comedian is someone whose unconscious is undoubtedly dominated by the jester archetype, and thus he will always sting people with what they do not want to hear. The comedy thus is rather a way, a wolf in sheep's clothing, to bring up serious problems that are circulating in a given society. Thus, I always pay attention to what comedians are joking about, as a good comedian is a trustworthy whistleblower, primed with the intuition to uncover the developing diseases of a given society. I'm leading to George Carlin's rant about child worship, about how in America parents are over and hyper-caring, and how children are worshipped and venerated to an excessive degree. Now, of course, child adulation had its healthy manifestations in the ripe culture and its unhealthy ones in the civilizational phase. But at this point aside, the obsession with children has its deeper roots in the cultural cosmos of the West. Now, getting to the theme of American horror, it would be reasonable to say that fear and horror can now be thought as of the inverse of happiness and wonder. In other words, tell me what makes you the happiest and I'll tell you what scares you the most. So if Baby's Day Out, Young Sheldon and Home Alone and the reverse-aging Spider-Man are at the tip of the iceberg, horror movies could be found in the deeper layers. The horror of the West thus is to be gripped by the weight of its ancestors. Just take a look at the most popular horror films. Apart from its inspiration from Halloween aesthetics, which is imbued by the threat of dead souls and the ancestors, we get a new form of horror, namely the discovery that the dead are present in the living plane. Seeing the apparition of the dead and finding out that they are buried underneath your house is the highest form of horror for the West. This fear is in no way universal, as in cultures where the cult of ancestors hung heavily, it was a common practice to bury their dead underneath their houses. As a matter of fact, the skull being the symbol of fear and terror in the West was extremely important for ancient conservative societies, where a skull of the ancestors was removed from the skeleton so that it could then be decorated. The ancient site of Göbekli Tepe also involved the skull cult and a number of other Neolithic and Upper Paleolithic social formations. In the West, skulls and the deceased always harbor negative valency. It's as if the dead spirit can never represent something positive. The myth of the screaming skull and the haunted house is a particular horror of the West, where ancestors and the dead who are excessively disrespected and thrown away periodically disturb the living. Now, again, Faust has this to say to the skull and thus to his ancestors. You empty skull, I see you grinning down. Perhaps your brain, like mine, sought in confusion the light of day, but in the gloom twilight found your joyful urge, for truth had ended in delusion. Faust, a hero of the Western spirit, rejects his ancestors and thus takes the victory, as his soul is saved in the end. However, everything that Faust accomplished is reversed in some sense by another Faustian character of Shakespeare. I'm talking about Hamlet, who, despite being imbued with the same spirit, will experience a failure. Thus, from Western happiness to Western tragedy, Hamlet undergoes failure and death simply because he served and fulfilled the duty of his father. The play begins with the appearance of the dead king, who then inspires the young boy to seek vengeance. Interestingly, when the cult of the ancestor hangs heavy over your shoulders, it will inevitably result in a tragedy, at least for the Western ethos. After all, Hamlet, unlike Faust, is inspired by the school of Yorick, which foreshadows his subsequent death. Now, horror of Amityville, poltergeists and movies of this sort about haunted houses revolve around this theme. Shining, for example, as the meta-horror of the West is noteworthy here. What happens is that the protagonist loses his waking consciousness to the spirits of the deceased, namely to the dead spirits of Mesoamerican culture, the very culture for which the cult of the ancestors was primary and essential. Thus, the formula of Western horror is the opening of the portal between the living waking consciousness and the astral plane of the dead, where magic consciousness structure will overtake. And also take a look at how in both The Poltergeist and The Shining, as in other films, children, the young, shining, milky wonder childs, are the one who form a relationship with the dead and can see what's going on. It's as if it wants to remind us about the bloody decision of the West to barter ancestors in exchange for the wonder child. Now, the obsession with youth and youthfulness is a particular preoccupation of the West. Medieval alchemy, with its quest for the Philosopher's Stone, promised to find immortality and eternal youth. In Irish mythology, we have a place called Nanog, where immortality and a perpetual state of youthfulness are conceptualized as a form of heaven. The fountain of youth was thought to reside in Benini, and history has it that Spanish conquistadors sought it out. It's also noteworthy that art expressing eternal youth predominated during the Gothic period. Note that the quest for the Holy Grail in Arthurian legends also involved the fruit of eternal rejuvenation. Yuval Noah Harari terms the striving toward immortality a Gilgamesh project, where Western civilization will attempt to attain eternal youthfulness with the aid of science. Gilgamesh, coming from the ancient Mesopotamian epic, not only sought to attain immortality but represented one of the first examples of youth rebelling against the old people of the country. Ebert points out that in the less popular text Gilgamesh and Aka, Gilgamesh refuses to hear the advice and strictures of the elders and decides to rebel against the conquering Kish, which turns out to be successful, thus marking the first point at which youth overpowers the tradition. Again, we witness the civilizational opposition between mimesis directed to ancestors and mimesis directed to creative minority, which demarcates and differentiates progressive cultures from conservative ones. The West's quest for eternal youthfulness, apart from its alchemical pursuits and endeavors to get to the Philosopher's Stone, is also evident in Nordic mythology. The goddess Idun is of utmost importance to the pantheon of Asgard. She offers the golden apples with which Nordic gods are constantly rejuvenated. As a result of Loki trading her away, unsettling chaos overtakes Asgard, and the gods are enraged. They quickly make sure to get her back so that the primal instinct of youthfulness could be secured. Now, what's interesting is that we find the quest for youthfulness in China too, a culture where the ancestral cult is primary, emphasized by the filial piety of Confucianism. However, as I'm a time thinker rather than a spatial thinker, I always look at when it is something that takes place. Namely, this happened in a short-lived Qin dynasty. The emperor Qin Shi Huang ordered his servants to find the source of immortality. Interestingly, this is the period when the cult of the ancestors is at its weakest in Chinese culture. It's no accident that Han Confucians, and note that the Han dynasty acts as a basis for the Chinese ethnic identity, as they call themselves Han Chinese, portrayed the Qin dynasty as tyrannical, as it rejected and suppressed Confucianism, which is all about ancestral piety. Not only that, but according to legend, the Qin dynasty burned books and scholars so that the cult of the ancestors would go away. It is noteworthy that the very dynasty that sought eternal youthfulness is the one which is the most condemned by the Confucian school of thought, which emerged as a response to the decay of traditions that was taking place at that time. Now, I want to take a look at Lucas Cranach's Fountain of Youth, which consciously or unconsciously resides in every Westerner's mind. As with the promises of David Sinclair and cryonics, which is the Western obsession par excellence, trying to defer death, here we see a method of rejuvenation through the sacred water. There are three elements that I see in this picture relevant to the topic. First, old women are brought from the left side of the canvas and they are rejuvenated on the right-hand side. In cultural anthropology, the right-hand shift is frequently associated with the emergence of Apollinian waking consciousness, which takes place in Greece and Judeo-Christian realms. Apparently, for the West, rejuvenation and the waking consciousness are one and the same. The second element is the involvement of Western science, symbolized by the ancestor of David Sinclair here, on the left side of the painting, who inspects the older ladies. Western science, as powerful as it is, wrests reproductive capabilities from the Magian god of the Bible and tries to create humans on its own. Now, the third element here is what I call the entrance to the West, a sort of phase control, a portal. As you can see, after rejuvenation takes place, women are accepted and directed to the feast. Clearly, youthfulness is a necessary prerequisite to acquire ontological status in the Western metaphysical outlook. This point aside, I also like how child adulation shows itself in the franchise Incredibles, where the youngest member of the family turns out to be the most powerful. Now, in this section of linguistic differences, I want to draw your attention to the concept of ageism. Ageism refers to prejudice against someone or a group of people based on their age group. Now, what fascinated me while growing up in Georgia is how versatile and rich the Georgian language was in insulting children. As Martin Heidegger puts it, language houses the being. As a result, different languages revealed a lot about the cultural character of their speakers. So, for example, in Georgian, we have a plethora of disparaging phrases and idioms and words aimed at youth. And those words do not denote a bad child or one who is faulty in some manner. No, these are merely emotionally charged terms intended to demonstrate contempt toward youngsters. This is a form of preventive technology to neutralize the potential threat of change and transformation. Such preventive language tools are all over the place. If the West is directed to the sky with its soaring Gothic cathedrals, there's an amusing folk superstition in Georgia that counting stars would give you pimples. Were you also taught that counting stars would result in warts? Now, getting back to the topic of ageist words directed to children, I was always surprised by their scarcity in English. So, a brat, for example, is not just a child, but rather an annoying one. That's why it's always used in conjunction with the word spoiled. Punk, on the other hand, is not necessarily directed at children. Now, young might be the one which shows contempt. However, what's fascinating is that in English there's literally an army of derogatory words directed at seniors. I mean, the list is quite big and the ageist words directed at youth are nowhere near. Now, this contrast is quite noteworthy. It's as if you decide to fight ageism in the eastern part of the world, then you will have to defend youth from it. But fighting ageism in the West has to do with the treatment of the seniors. Even the fact that there is no formal version of the word you in English, as it is used both to refer to elders and to your peers, has always been rather surprising while learning English. So, for example, in English, granny is more or less a derogatory term. In Georgia, where the cult of the ancestor hangs heavy, grandpa, especially in communities where somewhat mafia aesthetics is romanticized, is used the same way as dog or the newly emerged G or homie would be used in English. Now, getting back to Toynbee's distinction between types of societies that look back and those that look forward would be useful again. For example, when I look at American elder tourists or people from Europe who have past their 40s, are always trying to look younger and dress like teenagers. And this is not something that looks awkward, let's say. Quite the contrary. This is not an act or a performance. As far as I am concerned, it happens naturally, and elders always keep the younger spirit with much success. Now, on the flip side, growing up in Georgia, it would always fascinate me how quickly youngsters would age. And this is not just a natural aging. Teenagers would always try to emulate their elder role models in every way possible, beginning with the way they drove cars, what hats they wore, and the way they dressed, behaved, or spoke. Now, I'm perfectly aware that emulating the elders and trying to look older is in no way constrained to a specific culture, and this is a universal phenomenon. But I'm not speaking about mere emulation here. Rather, I'm getting to the lack of the third principle, the lack of the future, synthesis, and the point of the mental triangle. The difference here between the West and the East is that in the East, a child doesn't just emulate his dad or uncle, let's say, but rather morphs into him, as if the ancestor is the template that has to be filled by its descendants. Thus, we get to the primordial contrast between mythic duality and mental triangularity. In the mythic, you either have duality, where one force substitutes the other, or they exist in a state of polar harmony. Whereas in the mental, everything leads to the third, the future, which will be a result of thesis and antithesis, a dialectical relationship, a young and the old, a descendant and his ancestor. Thus, as Faust disdains the achievements of his father, although he himself, like his father, also became a doctor, becomes more than his ancestors, simply because in every act of emulation lies the hidden opposition, which produces the fruit of progress and paradigm shift, necessary for social change and transformation. To summarize my somewhat ADHD-style iceberg, here are the key takeaways. The heavier the cult of the ancestors is on the society, the slower will be the pace of its technological change. By adding the third element to the binary world of the Magian civilizations, history becomes a dead object that has to be studied and then superseded. History will be solved by the coming of the modern world, which exemplifies progress and is rooted in the instinct of child adulation. The wonder child of the West will be the principle of technological revolution and reverse aging, which will produce yet unseen civilizational feats of engineering and social transformation. Unlike cultures that are conservative and directed towards their ancestors, West rejects the weight of its forefathers, exemplified by its short and simple burial ceremonies and the Day of the Dead, where on Halloween ancestors are to be warded off. The ageist terminology of the West is mostly directed against the elders, or elderly if you will, instead of children, which further shows its progressive nature. Quest for eternal youthfulness and immortality is a particular preoccupation of the West, so that the Faustian incessant activity and perpetual strive to attain the third could never end. Progress, ironically being the most emotionally charged word in the Western discourse, is foundational for the Western psyche. One side of the political spectrum idolizes the value of progress and the other rejects it, and points to its irrational and confounded basis. I maintain that this concept has way deeper roots and didn't just result from the whimsical creativity of Enlightenment thinkers along with the industrialization and advent of capitalism. It doesn't follow that criticism of progress is illegitimate. Quite the contrary, self-criticism is extremely necessary for one's well-being. And lastly, the myth of the wonder child, being the fundamental element of the Western spirit, permeates throughout the collective psyche, thus manifesting itself in different forms. One such manifestation is Hollywood cinema, where Wonder Child gets yet another chance to shine with the aid of projecting electronic screens.